Okay, so before we get started adding paper mache, it's really important, this is like the messy part. So it's really important that you kind of set up and prepared some materials before you get stuck in. So make sure that you put down either some plastic or some newspaper, just so that you don't get any glue or anything on the table that you're working on. And it's also really important to pre-tear some newspaper before you get started, because your fingers are going to get all covered in glue and gunky, and so you want to just be able to have a little pile of pre-torn strips ready to go. But not only that, but also maybe have some smaller pieces already torn up too, just so that you've got a variety for areas that maybe need a bit more detail. With tearing the newspaper, it's always better to tear from the top to the bottom rather than from side to side. If you tear from the top to bottom, you tend to get these really nice strips that come off really easily and pretty evenly. Whereas if you try to tear from side to side, you'll just kind of get these weird little chunks and it won't be quite as easy. So yeah, just make sure that you tear the paper top to bottom. Just makes your life a whole lot easier. Sometimes I'm using these newspaper catalogs that I get in the mail. Sometimes this is a mixture of this kind of like matte newspaper print and like a glossy kind of print. If you can, try to use the matte paper rather than the glossy, just because this tends to be a bit more porous, which means that it'll absorb the glue a bit more and just be a bit easier to smooth out and mold when you're kind of applying it over the top of your maquette that we've already made. So other things that you will need, you'll need a little container, just kind of a shallow, not too deep, because you don't want to be, you have to reach your hand in there. So about this depth should work really well. I've just taken a yogurt container and cut the top off so it's not so deep. But any sort of plastic container that you don't need, like a disposable container, so nothing that you're going to eat out of or anything like that, should work really well. Need something to stir the glue with. I just tend to use like plastic forks, but you can use like anything that you don't mind getting a bit of glue on. It's good to maybe, if you have some paper towel, it's good to have some handy just in case you want to wipe your hands off. Or like an old towel or a rag or an old t-shirt or anything like that. And then you'll need your glue and you'll need a little bit of water. So because I'm using Mod Podge, it's already basically kind of a form of Elmer's glue mixed with water. It's a bit more of a watered down version. But I'm still going to add a bit of water to it just to kind of thin it out a little bit. Which sort of like helps the material go a bit further when we're using it, but also sort of like helps the paper to be, it makes it easier to apply to the top. It doesn't make it so gluggy and like hard to use. So generally when we're creating paper mache glue out of Elmer's glue or wood glue, or in this case Mod Podge, the ratio that you want to mix it with water is 1:1. So generally what that means is you want to mix the same amount of water in here to the amount of glue that we have in here. So I don't know if I'm going to add quite that much. I'm just going to like play it by ear, because you don't want it to be too watered down, because then you might have issues in terms of things adhesing together. So I'm just going to mix that in with the glue. You kind of want this consistency that's not super tacky and thick, but also not too runny. So you don't want it to be like a heavy cream consistency, which I think this is what this is. You kind of want it to be, this is like a bit of a gross description, but you kind of want it to be like almost like a mucousy snot consistency. So this is kind of close to that. It's maybe a little runny. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit more. Because see, when I'm pouring the Mod Podge in, how thick that is. It's really thick. So we're just basically, by adding the water, we're just making it a little bit easier to work with. And we're kind of stretching that material out so we can make more with it. I think this looks pretty good to me, actually. Ooh, there's a big gunk in there. You kind of don't want that. Yeah, I think this is a pretty good consistency. It could probably be a tiny bit thicker. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to see how it goes. You can always add more glue. If it's not working out, you can just sort of like play it by ear and see how you go as you sort of make the paper mache. All right, so you just want to get set up. I'm going to put my glue over here so you guys can see it. So basically, this is a really simple part. So we're just going to take some strips. I think this is generally for the purposes of this, I think I'm going to make them around this size, maybe a tiny bit bigger. I'll make them about this big, just so that I can kind of put the strip completely over. And you just want to dip it in the Mod Podge. And then similar to when we were using plaster bandages, you just want to kind of take your fingers and run off any excess. So it's not like totally dripping, but it's definitely fully coated in the glue. And then you're just going to lay this down over the top and smooth it over. Like that. And then you're just going to repeat it. So yeah, very similar to the plaster bandages that we were using in our last project. So yeah, just smoothing the excess off. And that's also good too, because it, you know, you won't be using as much glue, so the material will last longer as well. So that you'll get these kind of areas where you'll have these sort of creases, so you can just kind of smooth that over. So the first layer is probably going to be a little bumpy and a little rough, also similar to the plaster bandages. And it's just kind of like the more layers that you add, the smoother the surface will be. So don't get discouraged if like the first layer that you put down is looking a little lumpy. Because that's definitely something that you can sort of smooth out and manipulate the more layers that you add. So the thing that's really important to note as I'm putting these layers on is when I hit the edges, I'm really pushing the paper mache up against that newspaper armature that we made underneath, just to make sure that you don't end up with like, so you have this like definite relief of the form coming up out of the background, and you don't end up with like newspaper running from here to here and really sort of distracting or distorting the clarity of the image that you initially had drawn. So when I'm getting to these bottom parts, I'm actually going to tear it into smaller pieces and kind of come up like this, just so that I can create this sort of definite roundness around the bottom, because if I was just putting a sheet over here, I don't think I would really be able to get that much definition. So yeah, just smooth it, making sure you smooth, because there's areas as well where the paper just doesn't really want to stick together that well. So yeah, you kind of just have to work with it, play with it, to get it to do what you want. And also just, yeah, keep in mind that this is the first layer. So it might look a little rough, but that's something that you can kind of improve as we create extra layers as well. I'm just going to get in here. This bit's a little tricky. But yeah, you want to kind of try to, rather than like clumping as much on as possible, it definitely, sometimes it's better to be a bit more conservative, because you can always add extra layers on top. The thing with paper mache is once it's there and it's set, it can be a little tricky to, you can't really carve away at it or take paper mache away. You can only really add more on top. So that's something to keep in mind as well when you're putting your paper, applying the paper. Just smoothing it down. If you smooth it down as well, it sort of adheres a bit better to that newspaper that we put down underneath, and you really can sort of like retain that initial form that you had before you sort of like build up another layer and kind of smooth down over the top. All right, so for the purposes of the demo, I'm just going to quickly show you how I would go about coating the handles of the urn. So in this area, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with some smaller pieces, so maybe something around this size, and just, you know, same as before, dipping it in. And then, you know, it's just a matter of taking it and kind of wrapping it around. So the first one I'm just going to do down here is sort of a way of creating, just attaching it to the body of the urn. So I'm just going to do like over the top like that. But when it comes to the actual part of the handle, that's the high relief element, you just take small strips like this and just kind of put them under and then wrap it around. But make sure when you wrap it around, it's sort of overlapping with that piece that I just put on before. So that you kind of, it's all joined together and you sort of start to build the paper mache handle out from there. So yeah, it's much easier if you start underneath, because you can't really see what you're doing underneath, but you can see how the paper is overlapping over the top. And you know, just keep in mind that this first coating of this high relief element, it's going to be a little chunky, it's going to be a little rough. But once you've got this first layer down and it's dried, the second layer will be a lot easier to smooth out, just because it'll be a harder surface that you're working on, and it won't be as squishy as this. So it's really important just to be patient, don't rush it, and just slowly and gradually building up this area. See how messy? It's already getting quite messy. It's definitely a messy process, but you can get some really interesting results. But also something to keep in mind in terms of, like, see how I'm getting some little puddles of glue, puddles of Mod Podge in the background. It could be a good idea at some point to sort of just run your finger over it, or like get a piece of paper towel, which is probably a better idea, and just wipe it off. It's not super fast drying. You've probably got about 20 minutes to half an hour before it starts to set up. So you can just sort of, you know, maybe if you want to take a break after you finish a handle or a part that you're working on, you can always just sort of like go grab a little piece of paper towel or something and just give it a wipe down so you don't end up with a weird texture in the background. It all depends. It doesn't matter if you're just going to paper mache over the background, or if you're planning on, I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways that we can use to decorate this, other than like including acrylic paint if you just want to paint it. But a really interesting sort of effect that we can use on the background is we can collage this, because especially because we're making it out of paper, I think collage is really appropriate. So if you're going to collage it, then it doesn't really matter quite as much, because you're going to cover over the background anyway. But if you were just going to paint this background, try to keep it fairly clean, because otherwise when you paint it, you're going to just have all these weird globby bits showing up in the background, and it might, if it doesn't look intentional, it just kind of looks a bit messy, and so it can kind interfere with what you're trying to make. So yeah, just slowly kind of building the high relief component. And you guys can, you know, I really want you to experiment with incorporating high relief. We weren't really going to do it with when we were working in plaster quite so much, but paper mache is kind of an ideal material with which to experiment with incorporating that into our relief. So almost done. And so you can kind of like, once you've wrapped it around, if it's a bit loose, you can kind of just squish it a little bit. Because the paper is sort of saturated with the glue, it becomes like quite moldable. And because it has that glue, it's soaked in the glue. If you squish it, just squish it with your hands, generally it'll just stick and stay in place like that. So I'm just going to finish this handle. So it gets a little bit trickier, I guess, when you get to the top. So, you know, it can be a little fiddly, but don't get frustrated with it. Just be patient. Because if you rush it, that's when, you know, mistakes can happen, and like, don't get freaked out. You're not really working against the clock. You can always add an extra layer, you know. See how this is kind of coming apart here? Just go back and smooth it down. Because once the glue starts to dry as well, it gets a bit tackier. And it'll sort of start to behave itself a bit more. Like, this is a very fiddly spot up here. But, you know, even if the second layer that I do will be also an opportunity to kind of smooth this out a bit more. Yeah, this isn't behaving. So yeah, it can be, you know, sometimes you have to try things out, do the method of trial and error, and figure out what works for you. If you are super patient, you might even want to tear like really, really thin strips like this, and then you can kind of just like wind them around, squish them down like that. Alright, so I'm going to come back once this is dried, and I'll show you guys how you can do the second layer, and how you can use the second layer to start to build, or the second and third layer, the top layers, to start to build some more detailed textures. So I'll use the second or third layer to start to build the face. Like, the face is what the detailed textures is going to be. So I thought I'd just come back because I was having a little trouble with this newspaper top handle, and I just wanted to show you guys a different way that I decided to go about it with the cardboard, which seems to be holding its shape. So I don't know, potentially with the high relief, maybe it is a better idea to use the cardboard rather than newspaper. This is like an interesting trial and error, let's call it. Because it is a bit firmer and it can support a bit more weight. So if you can look right now, the newspaper high relief is actually being weighed down by the glue, whereas the cardboard, I think, will be able to support that extra weight really well. So what I basically was doing was taking a strip about this thick, and then similar to what I was doing before, starting off underneath, but then actually like wrapping the whole strip around a couple of times. So this way you can kind of pull it tighter and you can smooth it down, and you kind of get a bit more, it just creates something that's a bit more of a solid layer around the outside. So So yeah, I would definitely recommend for the high relief components using cardboard instead. I think that is, it just creates a bit of a firmer armature, which is a bit more stable, which is what you want, because you really want this part of the relief to stand out and come apart from the background. You don't want it to be sort of like resting on the background like that newspaper. Yeah, see how it's holding, it's supporting itself. Just smoothing this down. I think part of the reason why some of this paper isn't sticking as well is because I think my Mod Podge mixture could have been a little bit thicker, and that would sort of provide a bit more support to the paper in terms of having it stick. But yeah, this cardboard handle is definitely easier to get around at the top. You can just sort of like curve it around like that. Yeah, see, that looks great. So yeah, definitely use cardboard. Like, you know, you still have an element of high relief with the newspaper handle, but I feel like the cardboard just definitely makes something that's a bit more supported and dynamic. And if you cut it into the thin strips, it is quite flexible. And if you wanted to be extra ambitious, you could potentially make your high relief armature out of cardboard like this. But if you wanted it to be thicker, say if you were making an arm or a leg or something like that, you could use a combination of these two techniques, where you create the armature, the initial armature, out of cardboard, and then you can tape newspaper in areas to that cardboard to bulk it up underneath the paper mache, and then paper mache over the top. So I really want you guys, like, I'm just showing you the basics, but I really want you to think creatively about how you want to utilize these techniques to make your relief, and just experiment, you know. You know, you can try out, make some little studies, make some little trials. But yeah, I really want you guys to get creative with it, and just figure out what works for you and what works for your project, what works for what you want to depict in your relief. Alright, so it's still not fully dry, but I think it's stable enough that I can start to paper mache over the top. So I've just cut some sort of smaller strips, just so that we can sort of get in there and get a bit more detail. I have some thinner ones that I cut as well, but I thought I would just start out with these to see how it turned out. So essentially I'm going over the whole thing, but I'm making sure that I press down on either side of the cardboard so that you retain that detail and it just doesn't kind of get flattened out. This needs a bit more glue on it. So yeah, you can see that you're able to sort of keep the eyebrow and the eye. I might actually try one of these finer pieces. I might cut it in half. So just sort of like similar to before, like trying out which method works best for like what you're creating in particular on your relief. Just slowly coating it with these really thin strips. You can kind of alternate too if you have thicker ones and thinner ones. Just sort of whatever feels right and whatever kind of works in terms of the level of detail that you want to keep. It's tricky too with the smaller pieces. They have a tendency to dry out a little bit quicker. So it's possible that you might need to just kind of go over it again with a little bit of the paper mache glue just to keep it secure. So yeah, so essentially you just want to keep doing this until you've covered all of this cardboard. So this is what I ended up with. It might be a little hard to see, hopefully not too hard to see in the video, just because it's kind of camouflaged now. But yeah, I basically put probably 2 to 3 layers of the thinner strips over the eyebrows, nose, eyes and mouth. We're not going for realism, it's meant to be a little stylized. The lips are maybe a little big, but you can see how where the eyes are, it kind of just flattened those surfaces out a little bit. So you get the kind of general facial expression on the urn. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this dry overnight, just so that it's fully dry. It's been sort of slowly drying, partially drying in between layers, but it's probably not fully dry underneath. So yeah, let it dry overnight, and then in the next demo I'm going to show you guys some different ways and different techniques that you can use for decorating the surface.